I never thought a family photo album would be the catalyst for my long-overdue awakening. My name is Sarah Thompson, and 2 years ago, I discovered I'd been systematically erased from my husband's family history through a meticulously curated collection of photographs where everyone posed happily together, during moments I distinctly remembered being present for. Funny how quickly reality shatters, just like the expensive crystal frame that slipped from my fingers when Mark's mother, Patricia, casually handed me their latest family photo collection during their 40th anniversary celebration. The exact moment she mentioned how perfect Osprey Point would be for their upcoming family reunion. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Looking back now, I can pinpoint the exact moment when I should have recognized what was happening in my marriage. It was a crisp October afternoon in Boston, the kind where golden leaves swirled around brick sidewalks, and the air carried that distinct New England chill that warns of the winter to come. Mark and I were attending his parents' annual autumn gathering at their Connecticut estate, a sprawling colonial home with perfectly manicured gardens that Patricia maintained with the same precision she applied to managing family relationships. We'd been married for just over a year, and I was still adjusting to the complex social dynamics of the Wilson family. Before meeting Mark, I'd built my life independently, working my way through college and business school without family support, eventually founding a tech startup that specialized in sustainable energy solutions. When the company was acquired by a larger corporation 3 years earlier, the windfall had allowed me to purchase Osprey Point, a small, pristine island off the Maine coast that had been my sanctuary and private retreat long before I met Mark. That autumn gathering was supposedly a casual affair, but in the Wilson household, even casual came with unspoken dress codes and behavioral expectations. Patricia had greeted me with her characteristic air kiss beside my cheek, her perfume expensive and subtle, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. "Sarah, dear, so glad you could join us. Mark mentioned you almost had to cancel for some business matter." Her tone carried that familiar hint of disapproval, as though my career was an inconvenient hobby rather than the passion that had defined my life. "I wouldn't miss it," I'd replied, the social smile I'd perfected for these gatherings firmly in place. The board meeting was rescheduled. What I didn't mention was that I'd spent weeks arranging that rescheduling specifically to accommodate this family event, knowing that any absence would be noted and held against me in the invisible ledger Patricia seemed to maintain. Robert, Mark's father, had nodded approvingly from across the room, his attention barely leaving the financial news playing quietly on the television. Smart move. Family comes first. Always has in the Wilson household. The irony of his statement, while actively ignoring his assembled family, wasn't lost on me, but I'd learned that pointing out such contradictions only led to uncomfortable silences, and later, private tension with Mark. Mark's sister Jennifer circulated through the gathering with practiced ease, her husband David dutifully following, with their twin boys, accepting compliments on their matching sweaters and perfect behavior. Jennifer had perfected the role Patricia had groomed her for: devoted mother, supportive wife, active in the right charities, and always deferential to the Wilson family traditions. In the beginning, she had made tentative overtures of friendship toward me, but those had cooled considerably after I'd declined to join the same charity board she chaired, explaining that my focus was on environmental foundations instead. "Everyone gather for a photo before dinner," Patricia announced after the appropriate amount of socializing had occurred. "Robert just got this wonderful new camera, and the light in the garden is perfect right now." The family moved with the synchronicity of people who had performed this ritual countless times, assembling on the back terrace where the late afternoon sun cast a flattering glow. I stood up from my conversation with Mark's cousin, smoothing my dress and moving toward the assembled group. Patricia was directing the arrangement with subtle authority, placing Robert in the center with herself beside him, Jennifer and David with their boys positioned perfectly to their right. Mark was guided to stand beside his mother. Sarah, would you mind terribly taking the photo? Robert wants to be in this one and you have such a good eye, Patricia said, extending the expensive camera toward me. Her expression was pleasant, reasonable, and I found myself nodding automatically, accepting the camera with a smile that felt increasingly stiff on my face. Of course, I replied, stepping back to frame the Wilson family in the viewfinder. They looked perfect together. 3 generations with the same strong jawline, the same confident posture, the same sense of belonging. I pressed the button several times, ensuring they had options to choose from. Let me take one with Sarah, too, Mark suggested, starting to step away from the formation. Patricia's hand settled lightly on his arm, her smile unwavering. Let's not disrupt the grouping now that we have it perfect. We can do more casual shots. Later, she said smoothly, and we should move inside soon. The caterers will have dinner ready. Just like that, the moment passed, the family dispersing with Mark drawn into a conversation with his father about some investment opportunity before he could return to my side. It was such a small thing, being asked to take a photo rather than appear in it. So minor that pointing it out would have seemed petty, oversensitive. Yet, as I followed the family inside, still carrying the camera that no one had reclaimed from me, I felt a distinct unease that I couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't the first time I'd been positioned as the observer rather than participant in Wilson family moments, but something about the practiced ease of the exclusion struck me more forcefully that day. Later that evening, as guests mingled over dessert and coffee in the formal living room, I found myself beside a glass-fronted cabinet filled with family photographs. The display was meticulously arranged: wedding portraits, graduation ceremonies, holiday gatherings, summer vacations. At their Cape Cod home, I scanned the images with mild curiosity until I realized what was bothering me. Despite being married to Mark for over a year, I didn't appear in a single photograph. Not our wedding portrait, not the Christmas gathering I'd attended the previous year, not the cruise we'd all taken to celebrate Robert's retirement. In each case, the photos displayed showed only Mark with his parents, his sister's family, his extended relatives. Admiring the family gallery? Jennifer's voice beside me was light, a glass of white wine held elegantly in her manicured hand. Mom updates it obsessively. Dad says she spends more time arranging those photos than some curators spend on museum exhibitions. It's very impressive, I replied carefully. I just noticed that the photo from Mark's and my wedding is different from the one we have at home. The one at home showed us together, beaming at each other under an arbor of white roses. The one in Patricia's cabinet showed Mark standing between his parents, all 3 smiling directly at the camera. Jennifer took a sip of her wine, her expression revealing nothing. Oh, Mom has very specific ideas about the aesthetic she wants to maintain. Everything has to fit the established visual theme. Don't take it personally. But it was personal, wasn't it? The systematic exclusion of my presence from the visual history of the family I had married into couldn't be anything but personal. Yet as I opened my mouth to say something more direct, Mark appeared at my side, his hand settling on the small of my back. There you are, he said warmly. Dad's opening that special scotch he's been saving. Come join us. His eyes conveyed a silent message. This was important, an inclusion I shouldn't decline. The moment to question Jennifer further slipped away as I was guided toward the study where Robert held court with the male relatives, pouring amber liquid into crystal tumblers. On the drive home that night, I finally mentioned what I'd observed. I couldn't help but notice that I'm not in any of the family photos at your parents' house, I said, keeping my tone light, conversational. Even from events I attended. Mark glanced at me briefly before returning his attention to the dark highway. Mom's always been particular about those displays. It's her thing, arranging everything just so. She probably just hasn't updated with the newer photos yet. His explanation was reasonable, dismissive in a way that made me question whether my observation was even valid. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Even our wedding photo was just you and your parents, I persisted. Not the one of us together. He sighed, the sound barely audible over the car's engine. Sarah, you know how traditional they are. In their minds, those photos represent the Wilson family lineage. It's not a reflection on you. It's just how Mom sees the world. Family bloodlines and all that outdated stuff. He reached over to squeeze my hand briefly. Is it really worth making an issue over some old photos? Put that way, it did seem petty. Making demands about photograph displays would only confirm Patricia's barely concealed opinion that I wasn't quite refined enough for her son, that my background was too ordinary, my success too new and self-made to truly fit their old money sensibilities. I let the subject drop, telling myself it didn't matter, that I was secure enough in my marriage and my own accomplishments not to need validation from picture frames on a wall. That was the first time I consciously chose to ignore a warning sign, to accept Mark's explanation rather than trust my own perception. It wouldn't be the last. The pattern continued so subtly that each individual instance seemed too minor to confront. Family photos taken at gatherings where I was asked to be the photographer. Holiday cards featuring Mark with his parents, and sister's family, sent during years when I had been present for the staged portrait session, but somehow excluded from the final selected image. Vacation compilations where group shots mysteriously contained everyone but me, despite my clear memory of standing among them when the timer was set. When I occasionally mentioned these exclusions to Mark, his responses grew more impatient over time. "You're reading too much into this," he would say. Or, "Mom's from a different generation. She doesn't mean anything by it." Or sometimes, "If it bothers you so much, why don't you say something to her directly?" But the prospect of confronting Patricia about something as seemingly trivial as photograph selection seemed guaranteed to position me as difficult, oversensitive, an outsider proving precisely why I didn't belong. Instead, I focused on building my own life parallel to the Wilson family dynamics. I maintained my position on several corporate boards, channeled my energy into environmental conservation projects, and spent increasing time at Osprey Point, my island sanctuary that predated my relationship with Mark. The 11-acre island with its renovated farmhouse and stunning coastal views became my true home, the place where I felt most authentically myself, away from the subtle power plays and unspoken judgments of Wilson family gatherings. Mark joined me there when his work schedule allowed, seeming to relax into a different version of himself away from his family's influence. On the island, we reconnected with the easy companionship that had drawn us together initially. Hiking, the wooded trails, swimming in the protected cove, watching Osprey dive for fish from the wraparound porch of the main house. During those times, the photograph issues seemed distant and unimportant compared to the real connection we shared. "You're different here," he remarked once, as we sat watching the sunset from Osprey Point's western cliff. "More yourself somehow." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I understood perfectly what he was seeing. He shrugged, his fingers laced through mine. "Just more relaxed, more confident, like you don't have anything to prove." After a moment, he added quietly, "I like that version of you best." I turned to study his profile against the darkening sky. "That version is always there, Mark. It's just harder to maintain in some environments than others." We both knew what I meant, though neither of us spoke the obvious aloud, that the person I became in his family's presence was a carefully modulated version of myself, constantly adjusting, to avoid disapproval. "They'd love this place," he said, changing the subject as he gestured toward the expansive view. "Dad would appreciate the investment value of coastal property, and Mom would probably start planning how to landscape the whole island." The comment sent an unexpected chill through me, disturbing the peaceful moment. "Osprey Point isn't an investment property," I said, more sharply than I'd intended. And I prefer the natural landscape. That's the whole point. Mark raised his eyebrows at my tone but didn't pursue the subject. Yet something had shifted. The introduction of his family into this space, even hypothetically, had disrupted the sanctuary I'd created. I realized then how carefully I'd kept these worlds separate. Mark's family with their Connecticut estate and Cape Cod summer home on one side, my beloved island retreat on the other. The thought of those worlds colliding created an anxiety I wasn't ready to examine too closely. As our 3rd anniversary approached, the divide between my married life and my independent self had grown more pronounced. I spent increasing time on Osprey Point, sometimes with Mark, but often alone, while he maintained the expected presence at Wilson family functions. When we were together in Boston, we moved in predominantly professional circles where we presented as the power couple. He with his investment firm partnership, me with my corporate board positions and conservation work. We looked perfect from the outside, and in many ways, our partnership functioned smoothly as long as we maintained these separate spheres of existence. The arrangement might have continued indefinitely if not for Patricia and Robert's 40th wedding anniversary. The celebration was to be an elaborate affair, with family gathering for a weekend at their Connecticut home, followed by a formal dinner at the country club where they'd held their wedding reception 4 decades earlier. Mark made it clear this was a non-negotiable event, one where my absence would create tensions we'd be navigating for years to come. It's important to them, he explained as we discussed the timing, which conflicted with a conservation conference I'd helped organize. 40 years is a significant milestone, and they want the whole family there to celebrate. The irony wasn't lost on me. The whole family, including me? Are you sure about that? The question came out more bitterly than I'd intended, but years of exclusion from the visual family narrative had left their mark. Mark's expression hardened slightly. Sarah, not this again. Of course they want you there. You're my wife. I could have let it go then, maintained the peace as I'd done countless times before. Instead, I walked to my office and returned with my tablet, opening a folder of photographs I'd been collecting. These are from the last 2 years of Wilson. Family events I've attended, I said, handing him the device. Look through them and tell me what you notice. He sighed but took the tablet, swiping through the images with increasing discomfort visible on his face. Each photograph showed the Wilson family in various configurations, holiday gatherings, summer barbecues, birthday celebrations, and in each one, I was conspicuously absent, despite having been present at every event. This could be coincidence, he said finally, but his tone lacked conviction. Maybe you were just taking a lot of these photos. I specifically remember being in the original versions of at least half of these, I replied quietly. Your mother must have gone to considerable effort to find versions where I wasn't present, or to crop me out of the images she chose to keep and share. Mark set the tablet down, running a hand over his face. What do you want me to say? That my mother is deliberately excluding you from family photos. That seems extreme, Sarah. She's traditional and maybe a bit controlling about family image, but I can't believe she'd do something like this systematically. Then how do you explain it? I asked. 3 years of family events and not a single photograph including me has been deemed worthy of saving or sharing. That's not coincidence, Mark. That's a pattern. He was silent for a long moment before responding. I'll talk to her, discreetly, before the anniversary weekend. I shook my head. Don't. This isn't about forcing her to include me now that she's been caught. This is about understanding what it means that she's been doing this all along, and that no one, including you, noticed or thought it mattered. The conversation ended there, unresolved like so many aspects of our relationship with his family. I rearranged my conference schedule to attend the anniversary weekend, recognizing that this battle wasn't worth the long-term cost of absence. Mark didn't mention whether he'd spoken to his mother as promised, and I didn't ask. Preferring not to know if her response had been dismissive or, worse, confirmed my suspicions. The anniversary weekend arrived with perfect early summer weather. The Wilson estate immaculate as always. Extended family and longtime friends filled the house and gardens, everyone dressed impeccably for the various scheduled activities. I wore a navy silk dress for the first evening's dinner, classic and understated in a way I knew would meet Patricia's approval, while still making me feel confident. "Sarah, you look lovely," Patricia greeted me with her usual air kiss. Navy was always one of my colors too when I was younger. So forgiving. The compliment wrapped around a subtle reminder of our age difference. She in her early 60s, me at 35, was classic Patricia, but I smiled and thanked her as expected. The evening progressed predictably, with toasts to the long, marriage and reminiscences about family milestones. I stayed close to Mark, determined to be visibly present beside my husband rather than drifting to the periphery as I often did at these gatherings. If Patricia noticed my uncharacteristic clinginess, she gave no indication, though I occasionally caught her watching us with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. After dinner, as guests mingled in the formal living room, Patricia approached us with purpose, carrying what appeared to be a leather-bound album. "Mark, Sarah, I wanted to share something special with you before we show everyone tomorrow," she said, her voice warm with an enthusiasm that immediately put me on alert. Patricia was rarely enthusiastic about anything involving me. "What is it, Mom?" Mark asked, his arm comfortably around my waist in a show of unity I appreciated. "Robert and I have been reminiscing while preparing for this anniversary," she explained, opening the album to reveal meticulously arranged photographs. "We've put together a collection of our favorite family moments through the years. There's something so special about preserving these memories, don't you think?" As she turned the pages, displaying carefully curated images of the Wilson family. Through 4 decades, I found myself tensing in anticipation. Would this be more of the same, a visual history that systematically excluded me, presented directly to my face? But as the chronology approached recent years, I was surprised to see myself appearing occasionally, standing beside Mark at a distance in a group shot, partially visible at the edge of a holiday gathering, present but peripheral in moments where excluding me would have been too obvious to ignore. "This is lovely," I managed, the words sticking slightly in my throat. The strategic inclusion of these few images where I couldn't be reasonably cropped out seemed almost more calculated than complete exclusion would have been. "And here's my favorite recent one," Patricia continued, turning to a page near the end. "From last Christmas." The photo showed Mark centered between his parents, his sister's family grouped to one side, everyone smiling directly at the camera. I remembered that photo being taken. I had been standing beside Mark initially, his arm around my shoulders, before Patricia had asked me to step aside, just for one with the direct Wilson line. The request had seemed innocuous in the moment. Now, seeing the result preserved as Patricia's favorite, the intention seemed unmistakable. "It's a beautiful family photo," I said, meeting her eyes directly, refusing to look away first. A challenge flickered between us, unspoken but undeniable. "Yes, family is everything, isn't it?" she replied, holding my gaze with equal determination. "Speaking of which, Mark mentioned you have that lovely property in Maine. Osprey Point, isn't it? It sounds absolutely charming." The abrupt change of subject momentarily disoriented me. "Yes, it's special to me," I said carefully, uncertain where this was heading. Patricia closed the photo album, her manicured fingers resting possessively on its cover. "Robert and I were thinking that it might make a wonderful location for the Wilson family reunion this summer. So much more private than Cape Cod has become, and I understand the setting is just breathtaking. We could gather the whole extended family. It would be the perfect way to cap off our anniversary year." I felt Mark tense beside me, aware of what she was asking. Osprey Point had remained my separate sanctuary, the one place where I maintained complete autonomy, free from Wilson family dynamics. In 3 years of marriage, I had never invited Patricia or Robert there, had barely mentioned it in their presence. Mark knew what the island meant to me, my private retreat, purchased with my own success, maintained as the place where I could be fully myself. The island is fairly small, I began, searching for a diplomatic refusal. The infrastructure isn't really designed for large gatherings. Oh, but Mark said there's a main house and at least 2 guest cottages, Patricia countered smoothly. And the grounds are extensive enough for outdoor activities. I'm sure we could make it work. The family would be so appreciative. Finding suitable venues for the reunion has become such a challenge with how popular coastal properties are these days. She was positioning it perfectly. A reasonable request that would be difficult to refuse without seeming selfish or unwelcoming. The weight of Mark's expectation pressed against me. This was exactly the type of family obligation he believed should be accommodated without question. Yet something in me rebelled at the thought of Patricia Wilson orchestrating her family gathering in my personal sanctuary, rearranging my space as she arranged her photograph displays, determining who belonged where. The crystal frame she'd handed me along with the album, containing the Christmas photo where I'd been excluded, felt suddenly heavy in my hands. As I looked down at the smiling Wilson family preserved behind glass, a perfect unit complete without me, something shifted in my understanding. The systematic erasure of my presence from family documentation wasn't merely Patricia's arbitrary aesthetic preference or generational traditionalism as Mark had suggested. It was a deliberate statement about belonging, about who was considered essential to the Wilson family narrative and who was merely adjacent to it. And now, having established that boundary so clearly over years, Patricia was casually proposing to bring the entire Wilson clan to the one place that was wholly mine. Not because she suddenly saw me as family, but because my property offered convenience and exclusivity that served her purposes. The glass of the frame caught the light as my grip tightened, reflecting fragments of the chandelier above us. Sarah is very protective of Osprey Point, Mark interjected, perhaps sensing my internal conflict. It's her special project. Which is precisely why we'd be so honored to experience it, Patricia replied smoothly. After all, sharing what we value with family is what creates lasting bonds, isn't it, Sarah? The frame slipped through my suddenly numb fingers, hitting the hardwood floor with a sharp crack. Glass shattered around the photograph, creating a starburst pattern that obscured the perfect Wilson family portrait. The room fell momentarily silent, attention drawn to the broken frame at my feet. I'm so sorry, I said automatically, kneeling, to gather the larger glass shards, careful not to cut myself. How clumsy of me. Patricia knelt beside me, her movements graceful despite her age. No harm done, she said, her voice pitched to carry to those watching. Accidents happen. The photo can easily be replaced. We have digital copies of all our important family memories now. As we collected the broken pieces together, our hands reaching for the same fragments, she added quietly, for my ears alone. Though I do hope this isn't some sort of statement about the reunion idea. That would be rather childish, wouldn't it? Looking into her eyes, so similar to Mark's yet so different in their calculation, I felt something crystallize within me. The broken frame wasn't a statement, but perhaps it should be. Perhaps it was time to stop accommodating the subtle erosions of my place and my autonomy, to stop accepting exclusion as something too minor to challenge. The frame was an accident, I replied, matching her hushed tone. But my answer about Osprey Point is intentional. The island is not available for the Wilson family reunion. It's my private sanctuary, not a venue for events, even significant ones. Patricia's expression hardened almost imperceptibly, her social smile remaining fixed in place for anyone who might be watching. "I see. Well, that's certainly your prerogative. Though Mark had given me the impression you'd be amenable to the idea. Family properties are typically shared for important gatherings, at least in the circles we're accustomed to." Osprey Point isn't a family property, I clarified, still kneeling among the broken glass, my voice steady despite the tension coiling through me. "It's mine. Purchased before I met Mark, maintained separately from our joint assets, and I value it precisely because it's separate from family obligations." Standing with the collected glass fragments carefully cupped in my hands, I added, "Perhaps one of those photos from your album would look nice in this frame once it's repaired. One that actually includes me might be appropriate, assuming any exist." I walked away to dispose of the broken glass, leaving Patricia still kneeling beside the empty frame, the perfect Wilson family portrait now marred by shatter lines spreading from its center. It was a small moment of defiance, unlikely to significantly change the dynamics established over years. But as I felt Mark's eyes following me across the room, I recognized that something fundamental had shifted. Not in Patricia's perception of me, but in my willingness to accommodate that perception, at the cost of my own boundaries. The evening continued around us, guests oblivious to the undercurrents flowing beneath polite conversation. Mark eventually made his way to my side, his expression carefully neutral. "Everything okay?" That looked intense with Mom. She asked to use Osprey Point for the family reunion, I said simply. I declined. He sighed, running a hand through his hair in the gesture I recognized as signaling his frustration. "She mentioned wanting to ask you about that. I told her it was your decision, but that you might be open to the idea for a special occasion." "Why would you think that?" I asked quietly. "You know what the island means to me. You know I've kept it separate from all this." I gestured subtly at our surroundings, the Wilson domain with its precise expectations and invisible hierarchies. "Because it's important to them," he replied, the familiar refrain of our ongoing negotiation of family boundaries. "And sometimes we make compromises for family." "Do we?" I countered, the question genuinely curious rather than confrontational. "Because from what I've observed, compromise in the Wilson family tends to flow in one direction. I'm expected to accommodate, to adjust, to accept being literally removed from the family narrative. When has anyone compromised for what matters to me?" Mark looked away, his discomfort evident. "You're making too much of the photo thing. Mom's just old-fashioned about how she displays family history." "Then why does she suddenly want access to my island? If I'm not important enough to appear in the precious Wilson family visual history, why should my property be made available for Wilson family use?" The questions came out more sharply than I'd intended, years of accumulated frustration finding voice in this moment. "Sarah, please." Mark's tone held a warning. "This isn't the time or place for this conversation. Can we just get through this weekend without creating drama? For my parents' sake?" Always for his parents' sake. Always their comfort prioritized, their preferences accommodated, their narrative maintained. I took a deep breath, weighing the cost of another concession against the relief of finally confronting the patterns we'd established. "We'll talk about this later," I conceded finally, unwilling to disrupt the anniversary celebration, despite my growing certainty that this conversation could no longer be postponed. "But we will talk about it, Mark. All of it. The photos, the boundaries, what kind of marriage we actually have versus what we're pretending to have." His expression flickered between concern and resignation. "Fine. After the weekend." He squeezed my hand briefly before being called away by his father, leaving me standing alone again at the periphery of the Wilson family celebration. I watched the assembled guests, the extended family, the longtime friends, the social connections, cultivated over 4 decades of strategic relationship management, Patricia moved among them with practiced grace, the perfect hostess celebrating a milestone achievement. Robert accepted congratulations with the confidence of a man accustomed to success in all his endeavors. They had built this life together, creating a family identity so strong that it had absorbed their children and expected to absorb their children's partners as well, not as equal contributors, but as supporting characters in the ongoing Wilson narrative. Standing apart from it all, still holding the empty frame Patricia had handed me, I realized I had a fundamental choice to make. I could continue accommodating, adjusting, accepting the role assigned to me while gradually surrendering more of my independence and identity, or I could reclaim my boundaries, starting with Osprey Point and extending to every aspect of my relationship with the Wilson family, including my marriage to Mark. The broken frame in my hands seemed suddenly symbolic. The shattered glass had revealed the true nature of the image it contained, just as this evening had clarified the reality of my position in this family. Patricia hadn't merely been excluding me from photographs. She had been defining the boundaries of belonging, establishing who was essential to the Wilson family story and who was merely adjacent to it. And now, needing something I possessed, she was willing to temporarily revise those boundaries while maintaining the underlying power dynamic. As guests began departing for the evening, promises exchanged about the formal celebration to follow the next day, I found myself standing before the cabinet of family photographs that had first alerted me to my systematic erasure from the Wilson visual history. The display had been updated since I'd last examined it, new images added from recent events, yet the pattern remained consistent. Mark appeared in numerous groupings, with his parents, his sister's family, his extended relatives, while I was nowhere to be found, despite having been present for many of these moments. The message couldn't have been clearer if Patricia had stated it directly. I might be Mark's wife, but I wasn't really part of the Wilson family. Not in the ways that mattered to her. Not in the record she was creating and preserving. Yet my property, my sanctuary, my independent success, those were apparently family resources when convenient. The revelation wasn't entirely surprising after years of subtle exclusion, yet seeing it so starkly displayed while still absorbing Patricia's request for Osprey Point created a clarity I couldn't ignore. This wasn't merely a controlling mother-in-law, maintaining outdated traditions. This was a deliberate strategy of establishing boundaries while maximizing benefits, and my continued accommodation was making it possible. As I turned away from the cabinet, I caught sight of my reflection in the darkened window. My expression more resolved than I had expected, my posture straighter than it had been in Wilson family gatherings for years. Something had shifted fundamentally, not in Patricia's perception of me, but in my willingness to accept that perception as defining my place and my worth. The broken frame I still carried was indeed a statement, though not one I had planned. It represented the fracturing of appearances, the revelation of what lay beneath the perfect surface we had all maintained. And as I finally set it down on a side table, walking away to find Mark and signal my readiness to depart, I knew that this fracture wouldn't be easily repaired with new glass and polite pretense. This time, I wouldn't be the one making all the accommodations to preserve a false peace. The drive back to our Boston apartment was quiet, both of us processing the evening's undercurrents. As city lights replaced the darkness of Connecticut back roads, I broke the silence. I meant what I said. We need to talk about what happened tonight, about what's been happening for years. Mark kept his eyes on the road, his profile illuminated by passing streetlights. It's late, Sarah. Can't this wait until after the weekend? No, I said simply. It's waited long enough. Our Boston apartment, a sleek penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor, had always felt like neutral territory. Neither fully mine like Osprey Point, nor embedded with Wilson family history like their Connecticut estate. As we entered, Mark immediately loosened his tie and headed for the bar cart, pouring himself a generous measure of scotch without offering me anything. The gesture wasn't lost on me. This conversation would be one he endured rather than engaged with. "I don't understand why you had to make a scene," he said finally, leaning against the kitchen island, drink in hand. "It was their anniversary celebration, Sarah." "I dropped a picture frame," I replied, slipping off my heels and feeling the cool marble floor beneath my feet. Hardly what most people would call a scene. You know what I mean. The tension with Mom was palpable, and then refusing the reunion request outright, without even discussing it with me first. I studied him carefully, noting the familiar defensive posture. Shoulders slightly raised, jaw tight, eyes not quite meeting mine. This was Mark in Wilson family protection mode, a stance I'd seen countless times over our years together. "Did you discuss with me first before suggesting to your mother that my island might be available for the family reunion?" I countered. "Because that's clearly what happened. She mentioned you'd indicated I might be amenable to the idea." He took a long sip of his scotch. "I said it might be a possibility worth exploring, that's all. It wasn't a commitment. But it was a discussion about my property that happened without me. Just like so many decisions and assumptions that involve me but don't include me." I moved to the windows, looking out at the harbor lights reflected on the dark water. Like the systematic exclusion of me from every family photograph for the past 3 years. Mark sighed heavily. "We're back to the photos again. I told you. That's just Mom being old-fashioned about family documentation. It's not just photos, Mark. It's a pattern that extends to everything. I'm included when it's convenient. When you need a +1 for events. When Patricia needs someone to help in the kitchen while the family relaxes. When my resources or connections are useful. But I'm not included in the narrative that matters to your family. The visual history, the decision-making, the inner circle." "You're being dramatic," he said, but the slight hesitation before he spoke told me he recognized the truth in my words. "Every family has its dynamics. The Wilsons have certain traditions, certain ways of doing things. You knew that when you married me." "Did I?" "Because I don't recall you ever mentioning that your mother would systematically erase me from family documentation, or that my role would be perpetual outsider, regardless of how many years we were married." I turned to face him directly. "What I did understand was that we were building our own life together, one that respected both our backgrounds and priorities. But that's not what's happened, is it?" Mark set his glass down with more force than necessary. "What exactly are you saying, Sarah? That my family hasn't been welcoming enough? That my mother's photo arrangements are some kind of deliberate conspiracy against you? Do you hear how paranoid that sounds?" "Is it paranoid when there's clear evidence?" I walked to my laptop on the side table, opening it and quickly navigating to a folder labeled Wilson Events. I started collecting these after I noticed the pattern. Side-by-side comparisons of photos taken at family gatherings. The originals, where I'm present, and the versions that ultimately appear in your mother's albums and displays. I turned the screen toward him, showing a grid of paired images. The evidence was undeniable. Photographs where I had been standing beside Mark, only to be cropped out in the displayed version. Group shots where I had been present, replaced by nearly identical images taken moments earlier or later where I was absent. Holiday portraits where the final selected image was invariably one where I had stepped away or was positioned at an angle that made cropping simple. Mark stared at the screen, his expression shifting from dismissive to confused to troubled as he scrolled through the documented pattern. "This could still be coincidence," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "Mom takes dozens of photos at every gathering. She's bound to choose ones that focus on direct family members. For 3 years? Without a single exception?" I shook my head. "This isn't coincidence, Mark. It's intention. And what bothers me most isn't even your mother's behavior. It's that you've never noticed. Or if you did notice, you never thought it was important enough to address." He closed the laptop, as if removing the visual evidence could diminish its impact. "What do you want me to do, Sarah? Confront my mother about her photo selection process? Demand that she include you in the precious family gallery? How exactly would that conversation go?" "That's not what I'm asking for," I said quietly. "I don't want to be included in your family's visual history through obligation or confrontation. What I want is for you to acknowledge what this pattern means, about your mother's view of me, about your family's boundaries, about your own willingness to notice when I'm being systematically excluded." Mark ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration I'd come to know well. "Fine. I acknowledge that Mom has been selective about family photos in a way that has excluded you. I'm not convinced it's the deliberate campaign you're suggesting, but I can see how it looks that way when you compile all these examples." The concession was minimal, but it was more acknowledgement than I'd received in 3 years of marriage. It wasn't enough, though, not when paired with his dismissal of my interpretation and his reluctance to recognize the broader pattern it represented. "And what about Osprey Point?" I pressed. "Do you also acknowledge that asking for my private island for the family reunion, after 3 years of establishing that I'm not really considered family, is deeply inappropriate?" His expression hardened. "The reunion is different. That's a practical matter, not whatever symbolic exclusion you think you've documented. The Cape House isn't available this year because of renovations, and finding a comparable private venue on short notice is nearly impossible. Osprey Point would be perfect, and it would be a meaningful gesture of goodwill from you toward my family." "Goodwill?" I repeated, incredulous. "After years of being treated as an accessory rather than a family member, I'm supposed to offer my sanctuary as a gesture of goodwill? The place that has remained my one space untouched by Wilson family dynamics?" "You make it sound like my family has been actively hostile to you," Mark said, his voice rising. "They've included you in every event, every holiday. Mom calls you for lunch whenever she's in Boston. Dad has offered you investment advice countless times." "Being tolerated isn't the same as being included," I replied. "And your father's investment advice has invariably been suggestions that I liquidate my independent assets and consolidate them under the management of his preferred advisors, coincidentally, giving your family greater visibility and influence over my finances." Mark stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. "Is that really how you see us? As some kind of calculating dynasty trying to absorb your resources and control your life? My parents have welcomed you as best they know how. If it doesn't, meet your expectations. Maybe the problem isn't entirely on their side." The deflection was so familiar. Any criticism of Wilson family behavior inevitably transformed into a suggestion that my perception was flawed, my expectations unreasonable. I had accepted this framing for years, adjusting my responses and modifying my expectations accordingly. Tonight, something had shifted. The broken frame had fractured more than glass. It had broken the pattern of accommodation that had defined our marriage. "This isn't about my expectations," I said firmly. "It's about reciprocity and respect. Your family expects full access to my life, my resources, my property, while simultaneously making it clear that I remain peripheral to the family identity, and you enable this dynamic by treating it as normal and reasonable." Mark's phone buzzed with an incoming text. He glanced at it, then back at me. "It's Mom," he said, his tone suggesting this took precedence over our conversation. "She wants to confirm we'll be at the country club by noon tomorrow for the photography session before the formal celebration." The interruption perfectly illustrated our ongoing dynamic. Wilson family demands automatically prioritized, difficult conversations postponed. But tonight, I wasn't willing to follow that familiar script. "Answer her," I said, crossing my arms, "but understand that our conversation isn't over. We're addressing this tonight, not after the weekend, not when it's convenient. Tonight." He frowned at my tone but responded to the text with quick, practiced motions. When he looked up, his expression had shifted to one of tactical appeasement, a look I recognized from business negotiations, designed to diffuse tension without making substantive concessions. "You're right," he said, setting the phone aside with deliberate care. "We should clear the air before tomorrow. Tell me what you need to make this situation better, and I'll do my best to address it." The phrasing was revealing what I needed to feel better, not what needed to change objectively. Still positioning my concerns as subjective grievances to be managed rather than legitimate issues to be resolved. But it was an opening, however calculated. "I need several things," I said, taking a seat at our dining table and gesturing for him to join me. This would be a negotiation, and I intended to approach it with the same clarity and purpose I brought to my board meetings. "First, I need you to stop framing my observations as oversensitivity or misinterpretation. The photographic evidence is clear. Your mother has been deliberately excluding me from the family visual record. That's not my imagination, it's documented fact." Mark sat across from me, his posture stiff but attentive. "All right, the photo pattern exists. I've acknowledged that. Second, I need you to recognize that this isn't an isolated quirk. It's part of a broader pattern where your family maintains clear boundaries around who truly belongs to the Wilson identity and who is merely adjacent to it. That pattern extends to decision-making, to financial discussions, to holiday traditions, to family planning conversations." His jaw tightened at this broader characterization. "That's more subjective. My parents have their own way of doing things, but they don't have some grand strategy to exclude you. Intent isn't the only measure of impact," I countered. "Whether your mother consciously plots to keep me at arm's length or simply operates from ingrained assumptions about family boundaries, the effect is the same. I remain an outsider regardless of how many years we're married. And what do you want me to do about that? I can't change how my parents see the world or how they've structured family relationships for 40 years. "No, but you can change how you respond to it," I said. "Which brings me to my third point. I need you to stop expecting me to accommodate Wilson family expectations without question, especially when those expectations involve my independent resources or spaces." Mark's expression darkened. "This is about Osprey Point. It's about boundaries," I corrected. "My island is a perfect example, but the principle extends to everything. I won't continue subordinating my needs, my comfort, and my autonomy to Wilson family preferences. Not when those preferences consistently position me as less important than full family members. So you won't consider hosting the reunion, even as a favor to me?" His tone had shifted to the persuasive charm that had attracted me initially. Warm, slightly vulnerable, appealing to our connection rather than family obligation. "The reunion request isn't about you, Mark. It's about your mother wanting access to an exclusive venue that happens to be mine. If she genuinely saw me as family, Osprey Point would be a place she'd have shown interest in visiting before now, not just when her usual venue became unavailable." He leaned back, studying me with narrowed eyes. "You've changed, Sarah. When did you become so adversarial about my family?" "I haven't changed," I replied quietly. "I've finally stopped pretending not to notice what's been happening all along. The question is whether our marriage can accommodate that honesty." The statement hung between us, its implications expanding to fill the silence that followed. For the first time since we'd entered the apartment, Mark seemed to fully grasp the gravity of the conversation. This wasn't merely about photographs or a family reunion venue. It was about the fundamental terms of our relationship. "Are you saying you're reconsidering our marriage?" he asked finally, his voice carefully controlled. "I'm saying our marriage needs to be renegotiated if it's going to continue," I clarified. "I can't go back to the pattern we've established, where Wilson family priorities automatically supersede mine. where I'm expected to accommodate without. Reciprocity, where my observations about problematic dynamics are dismissed as oversensitivity. Mark was silent for a long moment, his expression cycling through calculations I could almost track, weighing options, considering leverage points, assessing what concessions might appease me without disrupting the status quo with his family. It was the same expression he wore in difficult client negotiations, and seeing it directed at me only confirmed how accurately I had assessed our situation. "What does this renegotiation look like?" he asked finally. "Practical terms, not abstract. Grievances." I had anticipated this response, Mark's preference for concrete solutions over emotional processing. "For starters, I won't be attending the formal anniversary celebration tomorrow," I said, watching his face register shock followed quickly by calculation. "My absence will create questions, certainly, but that's preferable to continuing the performance of perfect Wilson family harmony." "You can't be serious," he protested. Missing their 40th anniversary celebration would be an unmistakable statement. It would hurt them unnecessarily and create tensions that would take years to resolve. "Perhaps," I acknowledged, "but attending would require me to suppress my authentic responses for another entire weekend, maintaining the fiction that all is well when we both know it isn't. I'm not willing to do that anymore." "What about a compromise?" he suggested, leaning forward with the intensity he brought to closing deals. "Attend the formal event, which is the most important part to them, and then we can address these issues directly with my parents afterward. A private conversation, with me fully supporting your perspective." The offer was tempting in its apparent reasonableness. Attend one more event, maintain appearances a little longer, then have the difficult conversation with Mark's promised support. But experience had taught me how these negotiations typically unfolded. Initial concessions leading to postponed confrontations, which eventually dissolved into resumed patterns of accommodation. "No," I said firmly. "I won't attend tomorrow. You can explain my absence however you choose. Illness, work emergency, whatever creates the least disruption. But I won't continue participating in a dynamic I've recognized as harmful to me." Mark's expression hardened. "An Osprey Point? Is that non-negotiable as well?" "Yes. The island remains my private sanctuary, not available for Wilson family events. That boundary is absolute." He stood abruptly, moving to refill his scotch glass. "You realize you're forcing me to choose between loyalty to my parents and accommodating your sudden ultimatums. After 3 years of marriage where these issues apparently festered without you addressing them directly, you're now demanding immediate compliance with your terms." The characterization was both predictable and revealing, framing my boundary setting as unreasonable demands rather than necessary corrections to an imbalanced relationship. "I'm not asking you to choose between your parents and me," I clarified. "I'm asking you to establish appropriate boundaries with your family that respect our marriage as an independent entity, not a subordinate extension of Wilson family structures." "That's semantics," he dismissed, taking a long swallow of scotch. "If I support your decision to skip tomorrow's celebration, I create a rift with my parents that will have lasting consequences. If I attend without you, I signal support for your perspective that will be equally damaging to family harmony. There's no middle ground here, Sarah." "There's always middle ground," I countered, "but finding it requires both parties to move from their entrenched positions. Your family has maintained rigid expectations about my accommodation to their preferences for years. I've consistently met those expectations at significant personal cost. Now I'm establishing necessary boundaries, and you're framing that as unreasonable disruption rather than overdue rebalancing." Mark paced the length of our living room, the city lights casting his shadow in elongated form against the far wall. The visual seemed oddly appropriate. His presence expanded beyond its actual dimensions, occupying more space than should have been possible, just as Wilson family priorities had expanded to dominate our marriage. "If you won't attend tomorrow, at least let me position it as a work emergency," he said finally, pragmatism overriding his initial resistance. That would be most believable given your board responsibilities, and least likely to create speculation about marital problems. That's fine, I agreed, recognizing the concession for what it was, not acknowledgement of my perspective, but damage control to preserve appearances. But understand that this isn't just about tomorrow. It's about resetting expectations for how our marriage functions moving forward. Meaning what exactly? His tone was wary, sensing that my intentions extended beyond this immediate conflict. Meaning I won't continue subordinating my needs and boundaries to Wilson family expectations, I said, meeting his gaze steadily. I'll engage with your family on terms that respect my autonomy and dignity, or I won't engage at all. And I need you to support that position actively, not just when I force the issue with ultimatums. Mark drained his glass, setting it down with careful precision. And if I can't meet those expectations, if navigating between your new boundaries and my family's established patterns proves impossible? The question hung between us, its implications expanding to fill our spacious apartment. This was the crux of our situation. Whether our marriage could accommodate my refusal to continue the patterns of accommodation that had defined it thus far. Then we'll have to reconsider whether this relationship is viable, I said quietly. I won't return to pretending I don't notice how I'm positioned in your family dynamic. That path is closed now. He studied me for a long moment, perhaps searching for signs of bluffing or room for negotiation. Finding neither, his expression shifted to something I hadn't seen directed at me before, a calculated assessment, as if I had transformed overnight, from partner to adversary. I should sleep in the guest room tonight, he said finally. We both need space to process this conversation before I face my family tomorrow. The suggestion was reasonable on its surface, but also revealing, creating physical distance at the first indication that I wouldn't continue accommodating Wilson family expectations without question. I nodded my agreement, too emotionally, exhausted to analyze the implications further tonight. As Mark gathered what he needed from our bedroom, moving through the apartment with the deliberate quietness that characterized his withdrawals from conflict, I found myself standing at the windows again, looking out at the harbor lights. The city continued its nighttime patterns, boats moving with purpose, buildings illuminated, life proceeding normally despite the seismic shift occurring in our 13th floor apartment. When he had closed the guest room door behind him, I moved through our bedroom, completing my own evening routine with mechanical precision. The familiar motions, removing jewelry, washing away makeup, changing into silk pajamas, felt suddenly foreign, as if I were observing someone else performing these actions in a life I no longer recognized as mine. Sleep eluded me, my mind, replaying fragments of our conversation against the backdrop of 3 years of marriage. Had I truly changed as Mark suggested, becoming adversarial where I had once been accommodating? Or had I simply reached the threshold of what I could continue to ignore about our relationship dynamics? The dawn arrived with hazy light filtering through partially closed blinds, finding me still awake, sitting in the window seat that had originally sold me on this apartment. From this height, the city appeared both vast and manageable, individual, components forming a functioning whole. Unlike my marriage, where the components seemed increasingly misaligned, functioning only through continuous adjustment on my part. I heard Mark moving in the kitchen, the familiar sounds of coffee preparation and quiet footsteps suggesting he was trying not to wake me. The consideration felt incongruous with the tension that had filled our apartment hours earlier, yet perfectly aligned with the superficial thoughtfulness that characterized so many of our interactions. When I emerged from the bedroom, dressed in casual clothes that clearly signaled my intention not to attend the formal celebration, Mark was standing at the kitchen island reading something on his tablet. He looked up, his expression carefully neutral. "I've been thinking about our conversation," he said, setting the tablet aside. "You raised valid concerns that deserve serious consideration. I can see how the photo situation would feel deliberate. From your perspective, Even if I'm not convinced that was my mother's intention, the partial acknowledgement was classic Mark, conceding enough to appear reasonable while maintaining plausible deniability about his family's less flattering behavior. I poured myself coffee from the pot he had prepared, allowing the familiar ritual to steady me for what promised to be a difficult morning. "Thank you for acknowledging that much," I said finally. "Have you decided what you'll tell them about my absence today?" He nodded, his posture shifting to the slightly defensive stance I recognized from previous conflicts. "I'll say, you've been called into an emergency board meeting regarding a potential acquisition, specific enough to sound legitimate, vague enough that no one can verify details. I've already texted Mom that you might be delayed or absent depending on how long it runs." The efficiency with which he had constructed and implemented this cover story was both impressive and disturbing, evidence of how practiced he had become at managing appearances where Wilson family expectations were concerned. "That works," I agreed, taking a seat at our dining table rather than standing at the island beside him. The physical distance was intentional, creating space for the difficult conversation that needed to continue. But as I said last night, this isn't just about today. It's about the fundamental terms of our relationship moving forward. Mark checked his watch, an unconscious gesture that nevertheless communicated his priorities clearly. The country club? Photography session would begin in 3 hours, requiring him to leave soon if he intended to arrive punctually, as Patricia would expect. "I understand," he said, though his distracted glance toward his tablet suggested otherwise. "And I want to have that conversation properly. But today isn't ideal given the timing constraints." "When would be ideal, Mark?" I asked, unable to keep the edge from my voice. "There's always a Wilson family obligation, a work commitment, a reason to postpone addressing the uncomfortable realities of our marriage. That pattern is precisely what I'm no longer willing to accommodate." He sighed, running a hand through his hair in the gesture I had come to associate with his growing frustration. "What do you want from me right now, Sarah?" "I have to leave for my parents' anniversary celebration in 40 minutes. I can't resolve 3 years of accumulated grievances in that time frame." "I want acknowledgement that this conversation doesn't end when you walk out that door," I said firmly. "That you won't spend the day being persuaded by your family that I'm being unreasonable or difficult, only to return home ready to resume our usual patterns of accommodation." "That's not fair," he protested, though without much conviction. "You're attributing motivations and behaviors to me that I haven't demonstrated." "Haven't you?" I challenged. "Every time I've raised concerns about your family's treatment of me, you've initially acknowledged my perspective, then gradually shifted to defending their behavior and questioning my interpretation. It's a pattern as clear as the photographic evidence I showed you last night." Mark checked his watch again, more openly this time. "I need to shower and dress," he said, effectively ending the conversation without addressing my observation. "We'll continue this when I return. I promise to consider everything you've said without allowing my family's perspective to overshadow yours." The promise was well-intentioned but fundamentally impossible. Mark had never demonstrated the ability to maintain boundaries with his family that would allow him to prioritize our relationship over Wilson expectations. Asking him to do so now, particularly in the emotionally charged context of his parents' anniversary celebration, was setting both of us up for disappointment. "Go," I said, making the decision easier for both of us. "Attend the celebration. Fulfill your obligations as their son. We'll address our marriage when you return." Relief flashed across his face before he could mask it with concern. "Are you sure? I could stay a bit longer if you need to continue this conversation now." "I'm sure," I replied, recognizing the offer as ceremonial rather than sincere. "Some distance might help both of us gain perspective." He nodded, already moving, toward our bedroom to prepare for the day's events. I remained at the dining table, watching steam rise from my coffee cup and dissipate in the morning light. The conversation had gone exactly as I had expected. Initial acknowledgement, followed by practical constraints that postponed resolution, with underlying patterns of prioritization unchanged despite our confrontation. When Mark emerged 40 minutes later, dressed impeccably in the tailored suit Patricia had helped him select specifically for this occasion, he paused beside me. "I meant what I said about considering your perspective," he offered, his tone gentle in a way that might once have reassured me. "This matters to me. You matter to me." "I know," I said, and in many ways it was true. I mattered to Mark, as his wife, his partner, an important component of the life he had constructed. What remained unclear was whether I mattered enough for him to reconsider the fundamental terms of that life, particularly where his family was concerned. "I'll call when things are wrapping up," he promised, leaning down to kiss my cheek, a gesture that felt suddenly foreign after our night of confrontation and reevaluation. "Should be early evening unless Dad makes one of his epic toasts." I nodded, not trusting myself to respond verbally without revealing the growing certainty that our marriage had reached a watershed moment, one that might not lead to the reconciliation Mark seemed to still assume was inevitable. When the door closed behind him, the apartment felt immediately different. Not empty, but clear somehow, as if a persistent background noise had suddenly ceased. I moved to the windows, watching as Mark's distinctive figure emerged from our building below, striding purposefully toward the parking garage where his Tesla waited. His movements were confident, assured, a man proceeding along a path he had always assumed was the correct one. For the first time in our marriage, I allowed myself to fully consider an alternative path, one where I stopped adjusting my course to align with Wilson family expectations and instead charted direction based solely on my own values and priorities. The prospect was both terrifying and exhilarating, like standing at the edge of Osprey Point's highest cliff, looking out over the endless Atlantic. I reached for my phone, scrolling to a contact I hadn't called in weeks due to gradual Wilson. Family influence distancing. Lisa Chen had been my closest friend since business school, the one person who had consistently questioned whether my relationship with Mark truly served my best interests. "Sarah?" Her voice registered surprise when she answered. "Everything okay? It's been a minute." "I'm not sure," I admitted, the simple honesty feeling like a release after years of careful presentation. "Are you free for coffee today? I could use a perspective I actually trust." Her immediate affirmative response, without questions or qualifications, highlighted what had been missing in my marriage: unconditional support untethered to external expectations or agendas. As I prepared to meet her at our favorite cafe in Back Bay, I realized I had made my first decision based entirely on my own needs rather than Wilson family considerations in longer than I could remember. The walk to the cafe cleared my head, Boston spring sunshine warming my face as I moved through familiar streets at my own pace. No need to hurry to meet Wilson family scheduling preferences, no careful calculation of appropriate attire for Patricia's approval, no mental rehearsal of acceptable conversation topics for Robert's comfort. Just movement through a city I loved, toward a friend who accepted me without qualification. Lisa was already seated at an outdoor table when I arrived, her face breaking into a genuine smile that contrasted sharply with Patricia's practiced social expressions. "Whatever's happening, it must be serious," she said as I settled across from her. "You've been ghost mode for months." "I've been Wilson wife mode," I corrected, the description feeling both accurate and disturbing when spoken aloud. "But I think that program might have finally crashed." Lisa's eyebrows rose as she signaled the server for our usual orders. "Trouble in perfect marriage paradise?" "I'm shocked," she deadpanned, the gentle sarcasm carrying no real sting. "What finally broke the Wilson spell? Please tell me you punched Patricia." Despite everything, I laughed, a genuine release that felt foreign after months of carefully modulated responses. "No physical violence." But I did refuse to let them use Osprey Point for their family reunion after discovering I've been systematically erased from their family photo collections for 3 years. "Hold up," Lisa said, leaning forward with sudden intensity. "I need details, all of them. Start with the photo situation because that sounds legitimately creepy." For the next hour, I shared everything: the gradual realization about the photographs, the anniversary party confrontation, my decision to skip today's formal celebration, the late-night conversation with Mark that had laid bare the fundamental issues in our marriage. Lisa listened without interruption, her expression cycling between outrage, vindication, and genuine concern. "I've never trusted that family," she said when I had finished. "Too perfect, too coordinated, like they all got the same manual on how to be Wilson appropriate. But the photo thing is next level. That's not just old-fashioned traditions or generational differences. That's deliberate exclusion. The validation from someone who knew me well but had no stake in my marriage provided unexpected relief. Mark thinks I'm overreacting," I admitted, "or that I've suddenly become adversarial about his family after years of peaceful coexistence." Lisa snorted. "Peaceful coexistence where you do all the accommodating and they give nothing in return isn't peace. It's surrender. And it's exactly what they've expected from you from day one." "The question is where we go from here," I said, wrapping my hands around the now cool coffee cup. "I can't go back to pretending I don't see the patterns. But I'm not sure our marriage can survive if I insist on equal consideration where his family is concerned." "The real question," Lisa countered gently, "is whether a marriage that requires you to accept systematic exclusion and subordination is worth preserving in the first place." The blunt assessment wasn't unexpected from Lisa, who had always valued authenticity over harmony, but it still landed with unsettling force. Was I prepared to consider ending my marriage over what Mark would characterize as photograph selection and family traditions? Or was I finally recognizing that those surface issues represented deeper incompatibilities about identity, autonomy, and mutual respect? "I need to go to Osprey Point," I said suddenly, the decision crystallizing as I spoke. "I need space away from both Mark and the Wilson influence to think clearly about what I want moving forward." Lisa nodded, unsurprised. "The island has always been your true north. I've watched you come back from weekends there more centered than months in Boston ever leave you." She paused, studying me carefully. "Want company? I could move some meetings around if you need a sounding board." The offer was tempting, but something in me resisted. "Not this time," I said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand in appreciation. "I need to hear my own thoughts without anyone else's input, even yours." "Understood." She returned the gesture, her grip firm and grounding. "But promise you'll call if that changes. Day or night, flight delays be damned, I'll be there." As I walked back to our apartment, my decision to retreat to Osprey Point felt increasingly right. The island had always been my sanctuary, purchased with the proceeds of my own success before I'd even met Mark. Its 11 acres of rugged coastline, dense pine forest, and renovated century-old farmhouse represented everything I valued: natural, beauty, self-sufficiency, quiet authenticity. That Patricia had suddenly expressed interest in this private domain only when it might serve Wilson family purposes seemed even more telling in retrospect. The island wasn't valuable to her as an extension of my identity or as something meaningful to her daughter-in-law. It was valuable as a resource to be utilized, much as I had been valuable as an appropriate wife for Mark, a role to fulfill rather than a person to incorporate genuinely into the family. Back at the apartment, I packed efficiently, selecting practical clothes for island life rather than the carefully curated wardrobe I maintained for Wilson family appearances. Jeans and sweaters instead of silk blouses and tailored slacks. Hiking boots instead of heels. Each item I placed in my duffel represented a step back toward my authentic self, away from the Sarah Thompson who had gradually morphed into an acceptable Wilson wife. I left a note for Mark on the dining table, concise and clear. Mark, I've gone to Osprey Point to gain perspective on our conversation and our marriage. I need space to think without the pressure of Wilson family expectations or ongoing negotiations. I'll call when I'm ready to continue our discussion. Sarah. No projected return date, no softening qualifications, no apologies for asserting this boundary. Just a straightforward statement of my needs and intentions. As I scanned my contact list for the caretaker who maintained the island, property when I wasn't in residence, preparing to alert him of my imminent arrival, a text message from Mark appeared on my screen. Photography session running long. Mom asking repeatedly about your absence. Dad making pointed comments about commitment and family priorities. Could use backup here if your meeting could possibly end early. The message perfectly encapsulated our dynamic. Mark caught between Wilson family expectations and my boundaries, seeking the path of least resistance rather than establishing firm boundaries of his own. In the past, I might have manufactured an excuse to appear, smoothing over tensions and sustaining the illusion of perfect family harmony at personal cost. Today, I simply replied, "Sorry, you're in a difficult position. I've been clear about my boundaries. Heading to Osprey Point for some perspective. We'll be in touch." 3 typing bubbles appeared and disappeared several times before his response finally came through. "You're going to the island now? In the middle of all this? That's incredibly selfish, Sarah. At least wait until we can talk this through." The characterization was predictable. Boundary setting framed as selfishness. My needs positioned as less legitimate than Wilson family expectations. I didn't respond, slipping the phone into my pocket as I closed my duffel and took one last look around our apartment. The space suddenly seemed like a museum exhibit of a life I had been gradually coaxed into accepting. Expensive furnishings selected to impress Mark's colleagues, art chosen for investment value rather than emotional resonance, even the view. Monetized as a status symbol rather than appreciated for its beauty. How much of this life was truly mine, and how much had I adopted to fit Wilson family expectations of Mark's appropriate partner? The ferry to Osprey Point made its final scheduled crossing at 7 each evening, which gave me just enough time to reach the coastal dock if I left Boston immediately. I tossed my duffel into the trunk of my own car, a practical electric SUV that Patricia had once described as admirably environmental but lacking presence, and headed north. As city streets gave way to highway and eventually narrow coastal roads, I felt tension releasing from my shoulders with each mile of distance from the Wilson sphere of influence. My phone buzzed repeatedly during the drive, Mark's name appearing on the screen with increasing frequency as the afternoon progressed. I let the calls go to voicemail, not ready to engage in the conversation I knew would follow. His mixture of frustration and tactical appeasement, the subtle redirection of blame for creating family discord, the implicit expectation that I would eventually yield to Wilson priorities, as I always had before. The small coastal town that served as gateway to Osprey Point appeared on the horizon, just as the sun began its descent toward the Atlantic. Unlike the manicured perfection of the Wilsons' preferred Cape Cod enclaves, this working harbor maintained its authentic character. Weathered fishing boats moored alongside weekend pleasure, craft, cedar-shingled buildings housing both practical services and tourist amenities. No exclusive shops or reservation-required restaurants, just honest New England coastal life continuing as it had for generations. Jack Mackenzie, the island's caretaker, was waiting at the private dock where I kept the boat that served as primary transportation to Osprey Point. At 67, Jack embodied the resilience of Maine coastal residents, weathered, practical, and unfailingly direct. He had maintained the island property since before I purchased it, his knowledge of its ecosystems and structural needs surpassing any formal credentials. "Evening, Ms. Thompson," he greeted me, taking my duffel with casual efficiency. "Wasn't expecting you until next month." "Everything all right?" His tone carried no judgment or expectation, just practical concern about unusual circumstances. "Just needed some island time, Jack," I replied, knowing he would respect the simple explanation without pressing for details. "How are things out there?" "Spring storm took down a few trees on the North Trail," he said, securing my bag in the boat as I stepped aboard. "Cleared the paths, but left the wood for you to decide what you want done with it. Osprey pairs back. In the same nesting site as last year, 2 eggs looking healthy last I checked." The update contained everything essential about the island's condition without unnecessary elaboration. Exactly the communication style I appreciated after years of navigating Wilson family conversations with their layers of subtext and implicit expectations. As Jack navigated the boat through the harbor and into open water, I breathed deeply, salt air clearing my lungs and mind. Osprey Point appeared on the horizon, its distinctive silhouette unmistakable even in fading light. The main house perched on the eastern rise, old-growth pines creating a protective barrier against Atlantic storms, rocky shoreline giving way to one perfect crescent beach on the sheltered southern cove. The island had called to me from the moment I first saw it listed for sale 5 years earlier. Not as an investment or status symbol, but as sanctuary, a place that resonated with something essential in my spirit. "Generators full and running," Jack informed me as we approached the private dock extending from the island's southern shore. "Stocked the kitchen basics when you messaged? You planning a short stay or settling in?" "Not sure yet," I admitted. "Playing it by ear for now." He nodded, accepting the uncertainty without comment. "I'll check in tomorrow unless you'd prefer." "Privacy. Just text if you need anything brought from the mainland." Once the boat was secured and my bag transferred to the golf cart we used for transporting supplies up the hillside path to the main house, Jack departed with characteristics: efficiency, no lingering conversation, no social expectations, just practical arrangements completed with mutual respect. The contrast with Wilson family interactions, where every exchange carried multiple layers of meaning and evaluation, couldn't have been more striking. The main house welcomed me with familiar simplicity, weathered cedar exterior giving way to pine floors and whitewashed walls inside, large windows maximizing ocean views, furnishings chosen for comfort rather than impression. I'd preserved the original farmhouse structure while modernizing systems and opening the layout to create flow between spaces. Unlike our Boston apartment with its carefully curated aesthetic designed to meet Patricia's approval, every element here reflected my personal preferences without compromise. I moved through evening routines with practiced ease, starting the wood stove against the spring evening chill, preparing a simple meal from the provisions Jack had stocked, pouring a glass of wine from the local vineyard, whose bottles Patricia had once discreetly removed from view when I brought them to a Wilson gathering. Each action felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been gradually accommodated away during my marriage. My phone, placed deliberately on the kitchen counter rather than carried with me, displayed a growing list of notifications: 7 missed calls from Mark, 3 text messages, and unexpectedly, a voicemail from Jennifer, Mark's sister. I had rarely received direct communication from her outside of group messages coordinating Wilson family events. Her sudden outreach felt ominous, a sign that my absence had created more disruption than even I had anticipated. Setting aside the temptation to immediately check these messages, I took my wine to the western deck, settling into an Adirondack chair positioned to watch the sunset over the mainland in the distance. The familiar view centered me: endless Atlantic to the east, Maine coastline to the west, sky shifting through deepening shades of orange and purple as the sun descended. This perspective had always provided clarity when life felt complicated, the island's natural rhythms reminding me what truly mattered beyond social expectations and constructed obligations. When darkness had fully settled and the first stars appeared overhead, I finally returned inside to confront the accumulated communications. Mark's text messages progressed predictably from frustration to tactical concern. 3:42 p.m. Can't believe you've gone to the island during this family crisis. This is exactly the kind of behavior that reinforces my mother's concerns about your commitment to family priorities. 5:17 p.m. Parents noticed my distraction during the celebration. Had to explain we had a disagreement. Now everyone's concerned. And asking questions I don't know how to answer. Please call me back so we can get aligned on messaging. 7:33 p.m. At least let me know you arrived safely. Whatever issues we're having, basic courtesy shouldn't be casualties. The progression revealed so much about our dynamic. His initial framing of my boundary setting as inappropriate behavior that justified his mother's concerns. The quick pivot to managing appearances rather than addressing underlying issues. And finally, the appeal to basic courtesy that positioned my independence as rudeness rather than necessary self-protection. Jennifer's voicemail was more surprising in both its existence and content. Sarah, it's Jennifer. I'm not sure how to say this exactly. Mark told us you had to work today, but something in his manner made it obvious that wasn't the whole truth. Father made some comment about your absence reflecting prioritization choices, and Mark. He actually disagreed with him, quite firmly. I've never seen him contradict Father about family matters before. Mother changed the subject immediately. Of course, but there's clearly something significant happening between you two. Well, if you need someone to talk to who understands the Wilson family dynamics from the inside, I'm available. This is my personal number, not the one Mother checks. Anyway, think about it. The message left me momentarily speechless. Jennifer had always personified successful adaptation to Wilson family expectations. The perfect daughter who had married appropriately, produced grandsons on schedule, maintained the right charitable involvements, and never challenged Patricia's authority on family matters, that she would reach out independently, offering alliance based on shared experience of Wilson family dynamics, suggested complexities to her character I had never been permitted to see. Even more surprising was the revelation about Mark actually contradicting his father during the family celebration. In 3 years of marriage, I had never witnessed him directly challenging Robert's pronouncements, particularly regarding appropriate family behavior. That my absence had prompted such an unprecedented response suggested something shifting in Mark's own relationship with his family's expectations. I set the phone aside without responding to any of the messages, needing more time to process their implications before engaging. Instead, I moved through the house, opening windows to let in the sound of waves against the shoreline below, the rhythmic pattern creating a natural meditation that gradually unwound the remaining tension had carried from Boston. Sleep came easily in the familiar bedroom with its simple white linens and ocean breeze, deeper and more restful than any night in our Boston apartment had provided in months. I woke at dawn to osprey calls echoing across the cove, the island's namesake birds beginning their day with the same purpose and clarity I hoped to reclaim for myself. Morning brought crisp spring sunshine and crystalline focus. I dressed in hiking clothes and boots, packed water and simple provisions, and set out to walk the island's perimeter trail, a ritual I had established years before meeting Mark, one that invariably restored perspective when life became complicated. The physical exertion of navigating coastal rocks and forest paths demanded complete attention, leaving no mental space for ruminating on Wilson family dynamics or marital negotiations. Near the northern point where Jack had mentioned storm damage, I discovered the fallen trees, 3 mature pines now creating a natural clearing where previously there had been dense forest. Rather than seeing the change as damage, I found myself appreciating the new perspective it offered, a previously hidden view of the mainland coastline now visible through the gap, sunlight reaching forest floor that had been perpetually shaded for decades. Sometimes necessary change looks like destruction at first, I reflected, settling on a sun-warmed rock to rest and hydrate. The thought felt applicable to more than just the forest clearing. My confrontation with Mark about Wilson Family dynamics had initially appeared disruptive to our carefully maintained harmony. But perhaps it was simply creating space for new growth, for perspectives previously hidden by accommodations I had made without questioning their cost. By mid-afternoon, I had completed the island circuit and returned to the main house, physically, tired but mentally clearer than I had felt in months. I showered and prepared a late lunch, finally ready to check my phone for any additional communications requiring response. Mark had called twice more and sent a final text that morning. 8:17 a.m. I'm trying to respect your need for space while also addressing this situation responsibly. Parents expect us for brunch today to close out the anniversary weekend. I'll explain your absence as extended work emergency, but we need to talk about next steps. This disappearing act isn't sustainable, Sarah. The characterization of my retreat to my own property as a disappearing act, rather than a legitimate need for independent perspective, was telling. Still positioning my boundary setting as irresponsible, behavior rather than necessary self-care. But something in his tone had shifted slightly from previous messages, a tentative acknowledgement that I might have legitimate reasons for creating distance rather than simply being difficult. Jennifer had texted once as well. 9:22 a.m. No pressure to respond, but my offer stands. Sometimes an inside perspective helps navigate these waters. Thinking of you either way. The unexpected alliance felt both tempting and potentially complicated. Jennifer had been fully formed within Wilson family expectations before I entered the picture, her identity shaped by Patricia's meticulous guidance since childhood. Could she truly offer objective insight, or would engaging with her inevitably pull me back into Wilson family orbits of influence? As I considered my responses, a third notification appeared, an email from Patricia Wilson herself, the subject. Line reading simply, regarding Osprey Point. My stomach tightened instinctively. Direct communication from Patricia outside of group messages or formal invitations was unprecedented in our 3-year relationship. The message was characteristically precise in its composition. Sarah, I hope this message finds you well. Mark has informed us you are attending to business matters that prevented your participation in our anniversary celebration. While disappointing, naturally, we respect professional obligations. Regarding our previous conversation about potentially hosting the Wilson family reunion at your Osprey Point property, I fear there may have been a misunderstanding of intentions. The reunion has been a cherished tradition for generations, previously held exclusively at family properties rather than commercial venues. My interest in your island was an invitation to include your property in Wilson family traditions, an incorporation rather than imposition. Perhaps when you return from your business commitments, we might discuss this matter more thoroughly. True family integration requires mutual accommodation and shared resources, after all. Regards, Patricia Wilson. The message was masterfully constructed to appear reasonable while actually reinforcing every problematic dynamic I had identified in our relationship. The pretense of believing my absence was business-related rather than intentional boundary setting. The redefinition of her request to use my property as an invitation rather than expectation. The subtle implication that my reluctance demonstrated failure to properly integrate with Wilson family values. And most tellingly, the closing assertion that true family integration requires mutual accommodation and shared resources, without acknowledging that such accommodation had consistently flowed in only one direction during our relationship. I set the phone down without immediately responding to any of the messages, needing more time to formulate replies that maintained my boundaries without unnecessarily escalating tensions. Instead, I decided to check the osprey nest Jack had mentioned. Grabbing binoculars and hiking to the eastern observation point where the birds had established their breeding territory. The nest was exactly where it had been the previous year, though noticeably larger. Osprey pairs add to their nests each season, some eventually growing to enormous proportions over decades of partnership. This particular pair had claimed territory on Osprey Point before I purchased the property. their fidelity to location, and each other providing continuity through seasons of change. Through binoculars, I could see the female settled on the nest while her mate circled overhead, occasionally calling out in distinctive vocals that carried across the water. Their partnership was both interdependent and autonomous. Periods of close coordination in nest building and chick rearing, balanced with independent hunting and territory defense. Neither dominated the other, their contributions different but equally essential to their shared success. The observation provided unexpected clarity about my marriage. Mark and I had never established that kind of balanced partnership. From the beginning, Wilson family expectations had formed the gravitational center around which our relationship orbited, my needs and boundaries consistently subordinated to maintaining that established order. What I was seeking wasn't separation, but rebalancing, a marriage where both our needs and families of origin received equal consideration, rather than automatic Wilson priority. As sunset approached, I finally returned to the house and composed measured responses to the accumulated messages. To Mark, I wrote, "I'm safe and well at Osprey Point. This isn't a disappearing act, but a necessary retreat to gain perspective on our relationship. I need you to understand that I can't return to our previous dynamic where Wilson family expectations automatically supersede my boundaries and needs. I'm ready to discuss what a more balanced partnership might look like. When you're prepared to engage without positioning my concerns as unreasonable disruption." To Jennifer, whose unexpected outreach felt both promising and potentially complicated. Thank you for reaching out, Jennifer. I appreciate the offer and am giving it serious consideration. There's clearly much about Wilson family dynamics we might productively discuss. I'll be in touch when I've had more time to process recent events. Patricia's message required the most careful response. After several drafts, I settled on deliberate directness. Patricia, thank you for your message. To ensure clarity, my absence from the anniversary celebration was a conscious choice following our conversation about family photographs and Osprey Point, not a business conflict as Mark may have suggested to minimize family tension. Regarding the island, while I appreciate your perspective on family properties and traditions, Osprey Point remains my personal sanctuary, purchased before my relationship with Mark and maintained as separate from our shared assets. Its significance to me transcends financial value or practical utility as an event venue. I believe genuine family integration acknowledges and respects individual boundaries as well as shared experiences. When I return to Boston, I'm open to discussing how we might all move toward more balanced relationships where reciprocal respect guides our interactions. Regards, Sarah. Sending these messages felt like planting flags in newly claimed territory, establishing boundaries that should have been present from the beginning of my relationship with the Wilson family. Whether those boundaries would be respected remained uncertain, but articulating them clearly created foundation for whatever came next in my marriage and extended family relationships. As evening settled over the island, I prepared a simple dinner and opened a bottle of local wine, carrying both to the eastern deck where the rising moon cast silver light across the Atlantic. The Osprey pair had settled into their nest for the night, their silhouette visible against the darkening sky. Separate beings united in purpose, but maintaining their distinct identities. The image felt like a vision of what healthy partnership might look like, a contrast to the absorption into Wilson family identity that had been gradually occurring in my marriage. My phone remained silent for several hours after I sent my responses, suggesting all recipients were taking time to process my unexpected directness. Just before midnight, as I prepared for bed, a single notification appeared, a text from Mark. "We need to talk in person, not exchange messages that can be misinterpreted. I'm coming to the island tomorrow. This has gone far enough, Sarah." The message contained no request for permission to enter my personal space, no acknowledgement of my expressed need for perspective, just declaration of his intention to arrive and assertion that my boundary setting had gone far enough. Even in attempting to address our conflict, he was demonstrating exactly the pattern I had identified. Wilson prerogatives superseding my clearly stated needs. I responded with equal directness. The island is my personal space, not a shared marital property. I've been clear about needing time to process independently. Your decision to come despite that clearly expressed boundary demonstrates exactly the dynamic I'm no longer willing to accommodate. I won't be here if you arrive tomorrow. His response came immediately. Where else would you go? Be reasonable, Sarah. We're married. We need to address this situation like adults, not play hide and seek across New England. The condescension was so familiar, positioning my boundary setting as childish evasion rather than legitimate self-protection. I didn't respond immediately, considering my options carefully. I could maintain my position and temporarily relocate elsewhere, demonstrating that my boundaries were non-negotiable. Or I could allow Mark to come to the island, using the neutral territory to have the difficult conversation our marriage required. After thoughtful consideration, I decided on a third approach. You're right that we need to talk directly, but Osprey Point is my sanctuary, not contested ground for marital negotiations. I'll return to Boston tomorrow. We can meet at the apartment tomorrow evening. His relief was evident in his response. Thank you for being reasonable. I'll cancel my coastal arrangements and see you at the apartment around 7 p.m. We'll work through this, Sarah. Some perspective for both of us might be exactly what we needed. The framing wasn't lost on me. My boundary adjustment positioned as being reasonable, while his intended boundary violation was recast as coastal arrangements. But I had made my decision based on pragmatic assessment rather than principle. Alone. Our apartment represented neutral territory where neither of us held particular advantage or emotional attachment. It was the appropriate setting for the conversation that would determine whether our marriage could evolve toward genuine partnership or had reached its natural conclusion. The next morning dawned with unexpected fog shrouding the island, transforming familiar landscapes into mysterious, undefined shapes. It seemed fitting weather for my departure, clarity temporarily obscured but still achievable once atmospheric conditions shifted. I packed methodically, leaving most provisions for future visits, but ensuring all personal items returned with me to Boston. Jack arrived mid-morning for his regular check of the property, his expression registering mild surprise at my packed bag. Heading back sooner than expected? He asked, the question neutral rather than judgmental. Temporary departure, I clarified. Some situations in Boston need addressing before I can settle in here properly. He nodded, accepting the explanation without further inquiry. Weather's turning. Storm system moving up the coast tomorrow. Want me to secure anything specific before it hits? The practical concern for the property's well-being rather than curiosity about my personal circumstances was exactly why I valued Jack's caretaking, focused on tangible needs rather than social dynamics or emotional subtext. Just the usual storm preparations, I said. I'll be back soon enough to address any issues that arise. The fog had begun lifting by the time we boarded the boat for return to the mainland, revealing glimpses of blue sky above and clear water below. Osprey Point gradually receded behind us, its distinctive silhouette remaining visible long after details had blurred with distance. Unlike previous departures, this one didn't carry the usual reluctance. The island would remain my sanctuary, regardless of what unfolded in Boston, permanent and unchanging in its significance to my identity regardless of marital outcomes. The drive back to Boston gave me time to prepare mentally for the evening's conversation with Mark. 3 years of marriage had established certain patterns in our conflict resolution, his initial frustration giving way to strategic appeasement, followed by gradual return to status quo where Wilson family priorities remained central. Breaking that cycle would require extraordinary clarity about my non-negotiable boundaries and willingness to accept potentially permanent consequences if those boundaries proved incompatible with his fundamental allegiances. Boston's familiar. Skyline appeared on the horizon by mid-afternoon, the city's energy a stark contrast to Osprey Point's natural rhythms. As I navigated urban traffic toward our Back Bay apartment, I felt myself shifting into a more guarded mindset. Muscles tensing slightly, awareness heightening, the instinctive preparation for navigating difficult interpersonal terrain rather than physical landscape. Our apartment building's doorman greeted me with professional courtesy, giving no indication whether Mark had returned early from his parents' anniversary weekend or remained in Connecticut following the formal celebration. The uncertainty created momentary hesitation as I rode the elevator to our floor. Would I find Mark already waiting, or have time to settle and prepare before his arrival? The apartment was empty when I entered, sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows to illuminate spaces that suddenly felt less like home than temporary accommodation. After 3 years of residence, I had expected deeper attachment to these rooms where Mark and I had supposedly built our life together. Instead, I felt strangely detached from the carefully curated furniture and artwork, the designer kitchen where we rarely cooked together, the formal dining area where we hosted strategic social gatherings rather than intimate connections. Moving through these spaces with fresh perspective, I realized how thoroughly they reflected Wilson family aesthetic values rather than any organic expression of our shared identity. The neutral color palette Patricia had suggested during initial decorating, the specific paintings Robert had identified as promising investments rather than pieces that spoke to us emotionally. Even the layout prioritized impression over genuine comfort, perfect for entertaining Mark's business associates, but rarely used for simply living our daily lives. I unpacked my island bag, showered away travel fatigue, and changed into clothing that represented compromise between comfort and presentation. Simple black pants and a blue cashmere sweater, rather than the power dresses I wore for Wilson family, gatherings, or the jeans and flannel I preferred at Osprey Point. The middle ground felt symbolic of what I hoped might emerge from tonight's conversation. Neither complete capitulation to Wilson expectations, nor total separation from the life Mark and I had constructed. At precisely 7, the apartment door opened. Mark entered carrying his overnight bag, his appearance impeccable as always. Tailored casual attire suggesting he had changed after the drive from Connecticut, hair perfectly styled, his entire presentation communicating control and composure, despite the circumstances. Only the slight tension around his eyes revealed the strain of recent events. "Sarah," he said, setting his bag beside the entryway table with deliberate movements. "Thank you for coming back to discuss this properly." The framing was familiar, positioning my return to our shared apartment as concession rather than strategic choice, establishing the conversation as one I had been avoiding rather than one I had initiated by confronting long-standing issues. In the past, I might have accepted this characterization unconsciously, allowing Mark to define the parameters of our interaction. Tonight, I chose different terrain. I decided our home was the appropriate place to address fundamental questions about our marriage, I replied, my tone even but firm. The apartment represents our partnership more than either Osprey Point or your family's estate. He nodded slightly, moving into the living area but remaining standing rather than taking a seat, maintaining the slight height advantage that Patricia employed in difficult conversations, a subtle dominance tactic I had observed throughout Wilson family interactions. "Before we start," he said, his tone shifting to one I recognized from his business negotiations, conciliatory but strategic, "I want to acknowledge that the photo situation was eye-opening once you showed me the evidence. I didn't realize the pattern existed, and I understand why it feels deliberate from your perspective." The acknowledgement seemed genuine, yet carefully limited, conceding the pattern's existence while stopping short of admitting its significance or his family's responsibility. It was classic Mark, offering enough recognition to appear reasonable while preserving room to minimize implications. "The photos are symptoms, not the core issue," I said, choosing to sit rather than remain standing, in unconscious posture competition. They're visible evidence of a dynamic that extends throughout our marriage. Wilson family priorities automatically superseding my needs and boundaries, with mutual accommodation flowing primarily in one direction. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair in the gesture I had come to associate with genuine frustration rather than tactical display. That's an extreme characterization, Sarah. Every marriage involves adjustment and compromise. My family has traditions and expectations, certainly, but they've made efforts to include you in ways that matter. Have they? I challenged gently. Or have they expected me to adapt entirely to their established patterns while making minimal accommodations themselves? When has Patricia ever adjusted her expectations to acknowledge my perspectives or priorities? When has Robert engaged with my professional accomplishments, except to evaluate their strategic value to Wilson family connections? Mark paced the length of our living room, the city lights behind him creating dramatic silhouette against the windows. They're from a different generation, with different ideas about family integration. The efforts they've made might not meet your ideal standard, but they represent significant adjustment from their perspective. I don't need ideal standards, I countered. I need basic reciprocity. The issue isn't that your parents haven't perfectly welcomed me. It's that our entire marriage has operated on the assumption that Wilson family frameworks automatically take precedence over any alternatives I might bring to the relationship. He turned to face me directly, his expression shifting from defensive to analytical. The problem-solving mode he deployed when traditional approaches proved ineffective. All right, let's say I accept that premise for the sake of discussion. What exactly would addressing this imbalance look like in practical terms? What specific changes would satisfy your concerns? The question was both sincere and revealing. Mark genuinely wanted solutions, but framed them as adjustments that would satisfy my concerns rather than fundamental rebalancing of our relationship. Still, it represented engagement with the actual issues rather than dismissal, which felt like potential progress. 3 specific changes, I said, having considered this question carefully during my time on the island. First, explicit acknowledgement that my boundaries deserve equal respect to Wilson family expectations, particularly regarding my independent spaces and resources like Osprey Point. Second, your willingness to establish appropriate boundaries with your parents when their behavior or requests disregard my personhood, such as the systemic photo exclusion. And third, genuine partnership in decisions that affect our life trajectory without automatic deference to Wilson family frameworks. Mark listened with uncharacteristic attentiveness, his usual pattern of formulating counter-arguments while I was still speaking notably absent. When I finished, he was silent for several moments before responding. "Those don't sound inherently unreasonable," he said finally. "Though implementing them might be more complicated than you're acknowledging, particularly where established family traditions and expectations are concerned." Complicated doesn't mean impossible, I pointed out. It means requiring intentional effort rather than path of least resistance accommodation. He nodded slowly, moving to sit across from me, a physical indication of engagement rather than defensive posturing. "What prompted this now, Sarah? We've been married 3 years. If these issues have been present all along, why the sudden breaking point over photos and the island?" It was a fair question, one I had asked myself repeatedly during my retreat to Osprey Point. "It wasn't sudden," I said after thoughtful consideration. "It was gradual awareness reaching critical mass. Each individual accommodation seemed minor in isolation, stepping aside for family photos, accepting Patricia's decorating suggestions for our home, rearranging my professional commitments to prioritize Wilson family events. But collectively, they created a pattern of identity erosion I can no longer sustain." "Identity erosion seems dramatic," Mark countered, though his tone remained measured rather than dismissive. "Does it?" I challenged gently. "Look around this apartment, Mark. How much of what we're surrounded by represents genuine shared choices rather than Wilson-approved aesthetics? How many of our social connections are people I introduced versus extensions of your family network? How often have my professional accomplishments been celebrated with the same enthusiasm as your career milestones? His gaze moved around our living space with new awareness, perhaps seeing for the first time how thoroughly it reflected his family's influence rather than our unique partnership. I hadn't thought about it that way, he admitted quietly. It just seemed natural to continue with what worked for my family, what I was accustomed to. That's exactly the point, I said. What was natural for you became normative for us, without conscious evaluation of alternatives or acknowledgement of the compromises that arrangement required primarily from me. Mark was silent again, his expression suggesting genuine reconsideration rather than tactical pause. I spoke with Jennifer yesterday, he said finally, after you left for the island. She said something that's been on my mind, that perhaps I've unconsciously expected you to integrate into Wilson frameworks the way she did with David, without recognizing how different those situations are. The revelation that Jennifer had spoken directly to Mark about family dynamics was surprising, suggesting shifts occurring beyond my direct influence. Different how? I asked, curious about his perception of the distinction. Jennifer was raised within those expectations, he said thoughtfully. She internalized them from childhood, so adapting to married life within Wilson traditions wasn't adaptation at all. It was continuation. You came from entirely different circumstances, with your own established identity and success. Expecting the same seamless integration was probably unrealistic from the beginning. The acknowledgement felt momentous, perhaps the first time Mark had recognized that Wilson family expectations might be contextual rather than universal, that my resistance wasn't stubborn difficulty, but legitimate difference in perspective and experience. It wasn't just unrealistic, I said gently. It was fundamentally unbalanced, asking me to abandon self-determination in favor of predetermined patterns while offering little reciprocal accommodation in return. He nodded slowly, rubbing his temples in the gesture I recognized as indicating genuine mental recalibration rather than performative consideration. I need to think about all this, he said finally. You've raised valid points that deserve serious reflection. But I also need you to understand that completely dismantling my family relationships isn't a viable solution. We need to find middle ground that respects your boundaries without requiring me to sever fundamental connections. I've never asked you to sever connections, I clarified. I've asked for balance and reciprocity, for Wilson family expectations to be one consideration among many in our decision-making, not the automatic default that supersedes all alternatives. Mark stood and moved to the windows, looking out at the city lights with hands clasped behind his back, his characteristic pose when processing complex information without immediate resolution. Mother wants to have dinner with us tomorrow, he said after extended silence, to discuss the reunion situation directly. I told her I needed to speak with you first. The immediate return to practical negotiations rather than continued exploration of underlying dynamics was classic Mark, seeking actionable steps before fully processing emotional complexities. But the acknowledgement that he needed to consult me before committing to his mother's request represented small but meaningful shift from previous patterns. I'm not ready for that conversation yet, I said honestly. Meeting with Patricia before we've established clearer understanding between ourselves would likely reinforce existing dynamics rather than create space for change. He turned back toward me, his expression suggesting internal conflict between habitual accommodation of his mother's expectations and recognition of my legitimate boundary. She won't respond well to continued postponement, he said, the statement more observation than pressure. That's valuable information about her expectations, I acknowledged, but not determinative of our decisions as an independent partnership. Something shifted in Mark's expression. Surprise followed by thoughtful consideration, as if hearing a perspective that hadn't previously entered his framework. "You're right," he said finally. "Her reaction is separate from our process as a couple. I'll let her know we need more time before any family discussions." The simple statement represented potentially significant evolution, prioritizing our marital communication over immediate response to Wilson family expectations. Whether it indicated lasting change or temporary accommodation remained to be seen, but it offered hope that genuine partnership might be possible if both of us committed to the necessary adjustments. "Thank you," I said simply. "That feels like a step toward the balance I've been describing." Mark nodded, moving back to sit across from me with renewed focus. "I don't want to lose our marriage, Sarah. Despite everything we're discussing, I believe what we've built together has value worth preserving and strengthening. But I need to understand exactly what you need to move forward. Concrete, specific changes, not just conceptual rebalancing." The directness felt refreshing after years of diplomatic negotiations around Wilson family sensitivities. "I've already articulated 3 specific changes," I reminded him. "Respect for my boundaries, particularly regarding Osprey Point. Your willingness to establish appropriate limits with your family when their behavior disregards my personhood, and genuine partnership in decisions affecting our trajectory, without automatic deference to Wilson frameworks." "Those are still somewhat abstract," he pressed. "Let's make them tangible. Regarding Osprey Point, for instance, does that mean the island is permanently off-limits to my family under any circumstances? Or are there conditions under which shared access might be appropriate?" The question was reasonable, seeking practical parameters rather than all-or-nothing positions. "The island remains my sanctuary," I said after careful consideration. "Not available for large family gatherings or events, but I could envision eventually welcoming you and your parents for a weekend visit, not as Wilson territory to be incorporated, but as guests in my personal space with boundaries respected." Mark seemed to weigh this carefully, assessing whether such limited access would satisfy his family's expectations. "And the photo situation?" he asked. "What specific change would address that concern?" "Direct acknowledgement from your mother that the pattern existed and was inappropriate," I said without hesitation. "Not because I need to be centered in every Wilson family photograph, but because systematically excluding me from family documentation, while simultaneously expecting access to my resources, represents fundamental disrespect that requires recognition before moving forward." He winced slightly at the directness of this expectation. That conversation would be challenging. Mother doesn't acknowledge being wrong easily. "Which is precisely why it's necessary," I pointed out. "If she can't recognize even this clearly documented pattern of exclusion, what hope is there for more balanced relationship moving forward?" Mark was silent again, the reality of what I was asking clearly sinking in. Not simple surface adjustments to keep peace, but fundamental recalibration of family dynamics that had operated unquestioned for generations. "And the third element?" he asked finally. "Partnership in decisions without automatic deference to Wilson frameworks. What does that look like practically?" "Equal consideration of both our priorities and perspectives," I said. "Whether deciding holiday plans, financial investments, home decor choices, or potential children's names, approaching each decision as genuinely collaborative rather than variations." The Wilson family reunion arrived on a picture-perfect summer weekend, though not at Osprey Point. After weeks of tense negotiations, honest conversations, and unexpected alliances, we had reached a compromise that honored both family tradition and my personal boundaries. The gathering took place at a coastal resort Mark and I selected together, neutral territory that belonged to neither the Wilsons nor me exclusively. I stood at the edge of the resort's expansive lawn, watching as Patricia directed the photographer, positioning everyone for the formal family portrait. Mark approached, slipping his arm around my waist with newfound confidence. "She's requesting we join the center group," he said, his voice calm and certain. No longer the anxious mediator between wife and mother, but a husband who had found his balance. "If you're comfortable with that." "I am," I replied, genuinely meaning it. The past months had transformed our marriage in ways I hadn't thought possible. Mark establishing clear boundaries with his parents, Patricia acknowledging, albeit reluctantly, her systematic exclusion of me from family documentation. Robert actually asking about my conservation work with genuine interest rather than strategic assessment. Jennifer stood nearby, no longer the perfect Wilson daughter, but a woman gradually reclaiming her authentic voice. She caught my eye and smiled, a genuine connection between equals rather than prescribed roles. Our coffee meetings had become regular occurrences, creating relationship independent of Wilson family frameworks. "Everyone ready?" the photographer called, adjusting his equipment as family members arranged themselves according to Patricia's subtle direction. Mark squeezed my hand before we stepped forward together. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" I asked. "For not giving up on us. For demanding better than what we had. For showing me what real partnership looks like." As we took our places in the center of the Wilson family portrait, my presence no longer peripheral or erasable but acknowledged as essential, Patricia approached with uncharacteristic hesitation. "Sarah," she said quietly, "I've been thinking about your invitation to visit Osprey Point this fall. Just the four of us, as you suggested. We would be honored to see your sanctuary on your terms." The acknowledgement of my boundaries represented significant evolution from the woman who had once assumed automatic access to my personal space. Not perfect transformation, but meaningful progress toward mutual respect. "I look forward to it," I replied sincerely. The camera flashed, capturing the Wilson family in that moment of genuine transition. Traditional structures still visible, but evolving towards something more balanced, more respectful of individual boundaries within collective identity. My image would appear in this photograph not because I had surrendered my boundaries to gain acceptance, but because they had expanded their definition of family to include authentic partnership rather than prescribed roles. Some traditions were worth preserving, others required reimagining. The difference lay in whether they fostered genuine connection or merely maintained established hierarchies. As the Wilson family dispersed after the photograph, I realized we were learning that distinction together, step by imperfect step. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.